Chapter 11 of Famous Men of Greece. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine. Famous Men of Greece by John H. Haaren and A.B. Poland. Chapter 11 Lycurgus. About 80 years after the Trojan War, the descendants of Hercules, with a large band of followers, invaded the Peloponnesus, or southern part of Greece, where Agamemnon and Menelaus had once lived. They captured Sparta and made it their capital, and after that called themselves Spartans. The Spartans made slaves of people who were already living in the country, and called them Helots, or captives. The conquerors divided the land among themselves and made the Helots work their farms. After about 300 years had passed, it seems that some of the Spartans had grown rich, while others had lost their land and slaves and become poor. The Spartans who had lost their property were not willing to work like the slaves, and sometimes, when they had no bread for their children, bands of them marched through the streets of Sparta, broke into the houses of the rich and took whatever they could lay their hands on. During one of these riots, one of the two kings, for the Spartans always had two kings with equal power, went out of his palace to stop it. He tried to persuade the people to go quietly home, but they paid no attention to him, and a butcher in the crowd rushed up and stabbed him. The murdered king left two sons. The elder became king, but soon died. The younger was one of the wisest and best men that ever lived in Greece. His name was Lycurgus, and after his brother's death everyone wished him to become king. But an infant child of the late king was the rightful heir, and Lycurgus refused to be anything more than regent. For a while he ruled in the young king's name, but some people accused him of wishing to make himself king. So he gave up the regency and went traveling. He visited many lands and studied their plans of government. After being absent several years he came back to Sparta. There he found that the rich were richer and the poor were poorer and more unhappy than when he went away. Everyone turned to him as the only man from whom help could come. He persuaded the people to let him make new laws for Sparta. The first change that he made was to give every Spartan a vote. There was a senate of 30 which might propose laws, but all the citizens were called together to pass or reject them. Next he persuaded the rich people to divide their land fairly among all the citizens. So now no one had more than he needed, but everyone had a farm large enough to raise wheat or barley, olive oil and wine for his family for a year. No Spartan was permitted to work or to engage in any trade, but the slaves were divided, so that every Spartan had slaves to work for him. Besides the Spartans and the slaves, there was another class of men living on the lands of Sparta, who were not slaves like the Helots, and yet not citizens like the Spartans. These men were farmers, traders, and mechanics. They had to pay taxes and fight when called upon, but neither they nor Helots had anything to say about the government. There were about 10,000 pure Spartans and about 140,000 in the two lower classes, so you will see that the political power in Sparta was in the hands of a very few men. Their government was what we call an oligarchy, which means a government by the few. 2. Lycurgus did not wish the Spartans to become traders and grow rich, and it is said that he ordered their money to be made of iron. This iron money was worthless outside of Sparta, so the traders of other countries would not take it in payment for their goods, and sold nothing to Spartans. In those days soldiers fought chiefly with swords and spears; therefore, no matter how brave men were, they had to have physical strength to win a victory. Lycurgus made laws that the men and boys of Sparta should be trained in running, boxing, wrestling, throwing quoits, hurling javelins, and shooting with bows and arrows. The girls had nearly the same training. The feeble and deformed were thought by Lycurgus to be useless. Infants were therefore examined, and those that were weak or deformed were not allowed to live. A strong, well-formed infant was handed back to its parents with the order, "Bring up this child for Sparta." Boys remained at home until they were 7 years old. Then they were taken in charge by the state to be trained. The clothing given them was scanty. They went about with their heads and feet bare, and slept on hard beds, or even on floors, with rushes instead of a mattress. To teach the boys temperance, helots were sometimes purposely made drunk. Thus the boys saw how foolish men became when they drink too much. One lesson that every Spartan boy had to learn was to endure pain without flinching. Another was that in battle a man might die, but must not surrender. When the young Spartan was leaving home for the field of battle, his mother would hand him his shield and say, "Come back with this, or upon this." Lycurgus was opposed to all expensive ways of living. He thought that luxury was a waste of money, and made men weak and effeminate. He made a law that the men should not take their meals at home, but in a public dining hall, and there only the simplest kind of food was set before them: bread, cheese, olive oil, and a kind of black broth that was probably made of black beans. Figs and grapes served for dessert. It is said that some rich people were very angry because they had to eat at the public tables, and that one young man stoned Lycurgus. A great change came over the Spartans after they had adopted the new laws and ways of living. Instead of being a nation of idlers, they became so strong and brave that when there was talk of building a wall round the city, Lycurgus said, "Sparta's citizens are her walls." When Lycurgus saw what improvement had been made, he told the people that he was going on a long journey. He made them promise that they would not change his laws until he returned. He never returned. When the Spartans felt sure that he was dead, they built a temple in his honor and worshipped him as a god. He left Sparta about 825 B.C., and his laws were not changed for several hundred years. They made Sparta the greatest military state in Greece. End of the chapter 11.
Chapter 12 of Famous Men of Greece. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Graham Redman. Famous Men of Greece by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 12, Draco and Solon. 1. One of the first Athenians whose doings belong to history is Draco, who lived about 600 years before Christ. At that time the working people of Athens were very unhappy. One reason of this was that the laws were not written, and the judges were very unfair. They almost always decided in favor of their rich friends. At last everybody in Athens agreed that the laws ought to be written out, and Draco was asked to write them. Some old laws were so severe that often people had been put to death for very slight offences. Draco changed these severe laws and made new ones a great deal more merciful, and this made the people very fond of him. A story is told about his death, which shows that other people besides the Athenians thought a great deal of him. He went to a theatre on an island not far from Athens, and when the audience in the theatre saw him, they threw to him their cloaks and caps to do him honour. Unfortunately, such a pile of cloaks fell on him that he was smothered to death. Even after the laws had been written, the people were not happy, because Draco had not changed some laws that bore very hard upon the poor. These were the laws about debts. If a man borrowed money and could not pay it back at the right time, the man who lent the money might take the borrower's house and farm, and might even sell him and his wife and children as slaves. On most of the farms near Athens, stone pillars were set up, each of which told that the land on which it stood was mortgaged or pledged for a debt. Many of the farmers and their families had been sold as slaves. In time it came to be said that Draco's laws were written in blood. 2. Happily, a very wise and good man called Solon was then living in Athens, and the Athenians asked him to make a new set of laws. Rich and poor were surprised when they read Solon's new laws. The poor who had lost their farms and houses were to have everything given back to them. Solon thought they had paid so much interest for so many years that their debts should be forgiven. All who had been sold as slaves were to have their freedom, and no one was ever again to be sold for debt. Those debtors who had not lost everything were to be forgiven about a quarter of what they owed. All this Solon called a shaking off of burdens, and thousands of people felt that heavy burdens had indeed been taken from their shoulders. Solon did another good thing for the people. He gave every citizen a vote, and all could attend the assembly of the people, which was like a New England town meeting. There was a senate of 400, which proposed laws, but the people themselves met and passed them. So the people of Athens really made their own laws. Besides this, the assembly chose every year 9 archons, as the rulers of Athens were called. The chief archon was like the mayor of one of our cities, and the others like the aldermen. Under Solon's new laws, Athens soon came to stand in Greece for government by all the people, just as Sparta stood for government by the few. 3. When Solon saw that his laws were making the Athenians contented and prosperous, he made them promise not to change them for 10 years. He then went on a long journey. One of the countries which he visited was Lydia in Asia Minor. Croesus, the king of Lydia, was called the richest man in the world. He was so famed for his wealth that even now you often hear people say that a man is as rich as Croesus. Croesus was very proud of being so rich, and wished Solon to flatter him. So he asked Solon, "Who is the happiest man you have ever known?" He expected the Athenian, of course, to say, "Yourself, your Majesty." Solon, however, replied, "An Athenian peasant who never suffered want, who had a good wife and children, and who died on the battlefield for his country." "Who is the next happiest?" asked Croesus. "The 2 next happiest persons whom I have known," said Solon, "were the sons of a certain priestess of Juno. It was her duty to offer a sacrifice in the temple. When the time came for her to go, the oxen to draw the cart could not be found. So her sons yoked themselves to the ox cart and drew her all the way to the temple. She was so much pleased at them that she prayed to Juno to grant her sons the greatest blessing that they could have. The mother's prayer was answered, for the sons lay down to sleep in the temple and never waked. They had done their parts well in the world, and they left it without pain or sorrow, beloved and admired by all who knew them." "But," cried Croesus, "do you not think a rich and powerful king like me is happy?" "Ah, Croesus," said Solon, "I call no man happy until he is dead. You are rich, You are king of thousands of people, you live a life of luxury, but none of these things proves you happy. When I hear whether or not your life has ended nobly, then I shall know whether or not you were really happy." Years afterward, when Croesus had lost his kingdom and his wealth, he saw how wise this speech of Solon was. After 10 years of travel, Solon returned to Athens, where he lived in honour until his death. End of chapter 12. Draco and Solon. Recording by Graham Redman.
Chapter 13 of Famous Men of Greece. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine. Famous Men of Greece by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 13 Pisistratus the Tyrant. When Solon came back from his travels, he found that a young kinsman of his, named Pisistratus, was trying to make himself master of Athens. Pisistratus was rich and gave away a great deal of money, and in every possible way showed himself friendly to the people. His large and beautiful garden was thrown open to them as if it were a park. Men and women of the working classes were allowed to sit under his shade trees, and their children played among his flowers. When the poor were ill, he had nice things cooked for them in his own kitchen, and often in the heat of summer he sent to the sick a present of snow, which was a rare luxury. If a poor man died, Pisistratus often paid the expense of burying him. Poor people in Athens were very much pleased by this, because they believed that if a person were not properly buried, his soul would have to wander 100 years up and down the bank of the river Styx. One day, after the kindness of Pisistratus had made him the idol of the Athenians, he drove his chariot rapidly into the marketplace. A crowd immediately gathered about him, for they saw that something was the matter. In a state of great excitement he showed some wounds, which he had really made upon himself, but which he pretended he had received while he was driving along the high road. "Men of Athens," he cried, "see what my enemies have done to me because I am a friend of the people." All saw the blood on his face, and of course believed what he said. They were very angry, and one of them proposed in the public assembly that in future 50 men armed with clubs should be paid by the state to guard Pisistratus. Solon begged the people to vote against this, but they had made up their minds, and Solon could not dissuade them. The guard was ordered, and Pisistratus took good care that there should be in it a great many more than 50 men. Very soon he had a company of soldiers who were ready to do whatever he ordered. So, just as Solon had feared, he seized the Acropolis, a high rocky hill which was the citadel of Athens, and made himself master of the city. After a while the people grew tired of him, and he had to leave Athens. However, he came back and regained his power by playing a trick on the people. A very tall and beautiful girl, in full armor, rode into the city standing at his side in a chariot. Minerva herself was said to be bringing Pisistratus back. When the chariot came into view, the people shouted with joy and welcomed their old friend. Soon he was banished a second time, but again recovered his power, and from that day to the time of his death he had full sway over the city. 2. All the states of Greece had in time become republics, except Sparta, and when anyone took the power of a king in any of these states, he was called a tyrant. Thus Pisistratus was called the tyrant of Athens, and yet he was by no means so harsh a ruler as the word might lead us to think, but he was strict. When he got control of Athens, it was full of lazy people, who lounged all day about the marketplace. Pisistratus put all such people to work upon the roads or public buildings. There were no public schools or libraries in Athens, but Pisistratus did his best to give the people a chance to read and to educate themselves. Books in his days were not printed, but written, and they were so expensive that few people could buy them. Pisistratus had a large collection, and he invited all persons, rich or poor, to go to his library and read. He did another thing for which the Greeks were grateful. For more than 200 years before his time, the poems of Homer had been recited all over Greece. Traveling minstrels sang them before guests in banquet halls or before public gatherings. Everyone loved these poems, and many people knew parts of them by heart. Pisistratus employed learned men to help him write them and put them in proper order. The verses about the Trojan War were arranged to make up the poem called the Iliad, and those about the wanderings of Ulysses to make up the poem called the Odyssey. Athens never had a wiser or better ruler than Pisistratus. He died 527 B.C. End of the chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of Famous Men of Greece. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MCY. Famous Men of Greece by John H. Haaren and A.B. Poland. Chapter 14. Miltiades, the Hero of Marathon. Part 1. After Pisistratus died, his two sons Hippias and Hipparchus ruled over Athens. They governed well until Hipparchus was killed by his enemies. Then Hippias became so cruel that the Athenians banded together and drove him out of the city. Some time after being driven from Athens, Hippias sailed to Asia and begged Darius, king of Persia, to help him regain his power. At that time Persia was the greatest country in the world. Darius, her sovereign, was called the Great King, or simply the King, as if there were no other king on the face of the earth. He intended that there should be no other if he could have his way. He made up his mind not only to help Hippias, but also to make himself master of Greece. Persian heralds were therefore sent to every state of Greece to demand from each a tribute of earth and water. If the Greeks had yielded to this demand, it would have been the same as saying that all the land and water of Greece belonged to Persia. Some of the states submitted, others proudly refused. The Athenians threw the heralds into a ditch, into which the bodies of criminals were thrown. The Spartans threw them into a well and told them, "There you will find both earth and water for your master." As soon as Darius heard of this, he declared war, and a little later his fleet, carrying 150,000 men, set sail for Greece. The Persians landed on the Grecian coast and went into camp on the plain of Marathon, 22 miles from Athens. Meantime, the Athenians had not been idle. They had collected a force of 10,000 men, and the entire army was under 10 generals, each of whom in turn was commander-in-chief for one day. The little city of Plataea, unasked, had sent 1,000 volunteers. The ablest of the Greek generals was Miltiades. He determined to attack the enemy at once, and when his day of command came, on the 12th of August, 490 B.C., he drew up the Greek army in line of battle and moved across the plain. Then he charged upon the Persian army, broke their line, and drove them back to their ships in confusion. News of the victory was carried to Athens by a soldier, who though wounded ran the 22 miles from the field of battle to the city. Reaching the market-place, he rushed into the crowd of citizens assembled there, and cried, "Rejoice, rejoice, we are victors!" fell dead. This news delighted all loyal Athenians, but was very unwelcome to some traitors who had been hoping to hear of a Persian victory. These traitors had gone to a mountain near Athens, and with a polished shield they flashed to the Persian fleet a signal to sail to Athens and capture the city before Miltiades could return from Marathon. Fortunately the signal was seen in the camp of the Greeks. Miltiades guessed what it meant, and marched back to Athens immediately. So when the Persians approached in their ships, they found that if they landed they must again meet the army of Miltiades. They had no wish to do this, and sailed away across the Aegean Sea to the great king's own dominions. The Battle of Marathon showed that the Greeks were equal to any soldiers in the world. They had routed an army of Persians 15 times as large as their own, and had lost only 192 men. The Greeks believed that this splendid victory was won through the aid of their gods and of their godlike hero Theseus, who was said to have fought in the thick of the battle and made terrible havoc among the Persians. Part 2. Miltiades won great fame in Athens. Honors were showered upon him, and whatever he asked was granted. Thinking that he could add still more to his own glory and that of Athens, he asked that a fleet of 70 ships be placed at his command, and that he be allowed to do with it as he pleased. The fleet was granted, and with it he set sail for the islands of Paros. The people of Paros had helped the Persians in the recent war, and Miltiades wished to punish them, but he also hoped to avenge himself upon a personal enemy. The expedition was a complete failure. The town of Paros was not captured, and Miltiades was obliged to give up the siege and return to Athens. Moreover, at Paros, his thigh had been badly hurt while he was leaping over a fence, so that he came home injured as well as unsuccessful. Upon his return he was accused of having deceived the people and wasted the public money. When his trial took place he was brought before his judges upon a couch, being too weak to stand or sit. The decision of the court was against him, and he was sentenced to pay a heavy fine, which he was too poor to pay. Not long afterward he died of the injury that he had received at Paros. After the death of Miltiades, the Athenians were sorry for their harshness toward him. Remembering only his heroism at Marathon, they buried him with the highest honors on the plain where his great victory was won. End of chapter 14.
Of famous men of Greece. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philippa Jevons. Famous Men of Greece by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 15. Leonidas at Thermopylae. 1. Leonidas was the son of one of the kings of Sparta. As a boy he was trained in the gymnasium and excelled in all manly sports. As a man he fought in the Spartan army. After the death of his father and his half-brother, he became king. 11 years later he led the Greek army against the Persians, who a second time were threatening Greece. The second invasion of the Persians came about in this way. The defeat at Marathon had made Darius only the more determined to conquer the Greeks. But 4 years later, in the midst of his preparations, he died, and Xerxes, his son, came to the throne. Xerxes, after a while, decided to carry out his father's plans, and spent 4 years in collecting men and horses and ships. His army and fleet were the largest that the world had ever heard of. The land forces met at Sardis, a city in Asia Minor, and marched to the shore of the Hellespont, which you have already learned is the narrow strait between Europe and Asia. Xerxes ordered his engineers to make 2 bridges of boats across the strait for the passage of the army. This was done, but the bridges were not strong enough, and a storm destroyed them. The loss of his bridges made the king very angry, and it is said that he had the strait scourged with 300 lashes and a set of chains thrown into it, to teach the water that he was its master. 2 new bridges, stronger than the first, were built, and Xerxes then marched his army over them to the European shore of the Hellespont. Here his fleet of 1,200 warships and 3,000 smaller vessels had already arrived. On a hill overlooking the strait, a throne of marble was built, and upon it Xerxes sat and reviewed his land forces drawn up along the shore and his ships sailing in the strait. It took the army 7 days and 7 nights to cross the bridges. After crossing, the land force made its way southward, until it reached a high and almost impassable mountain range. Between this range and the sea, the roadway at 2 points was so narrow that there was room only for a single wagon. There were hot sulphur springs nearby, and therefore the Greeks called this narrow part of the road Thermopylae, which means the gates of the hot springs. We usually speak of it as the pass of Thermopylae. The Persians intended to march through the pass, but they were stopped by a Greek force under Leonidas, king of Sparta. His band numbered only about 4,000 men, of whom 300 were Spartans, the rest being from several different states. The Greeks took their stand at the narrowest part of the pass. Against them Xerxes sent one division of his army after another, but all were defeated and driven back. For 2 days the fighting went on, with great loss to the Persians, while the Greeks lost hardly a man. At last, when it seemed impossible to overpower the Greeks, a traitor showed a band of Persians a path that led over the mountain. This path was poorly defended by Greeks from one of the northern states. It was easily taken by the Persians, who then marched round behind Leonidas. Leonidas learned of their approach in time to escape. Some of his army did retreat, but he, with 300 Spartans and 700 men of Thespiae, a little town some distance from Athens, refused to do so. Greece had trusted the pass to them to hold, and they preferred to die rather than leave their post. When some one said that the arrows of the Persians would come in such showers as to conceal the sun, one of the Spartans replied, "So much the better, we shall fight in the shade." Leonidas was now penned in between 2 divisions of the Persian army, one at each end of the pass. Instead of waiting to be attacked, he led his men forward against the Persians. The Greeks fought desperately, but they had no chance against such vast numbers. All were slain, save one man. A monument was afterward raised to their memory. It bore the simple inscription, "Stranger, tell the Spartans that we lie here in obedience to their commands." After the battle, Xerxes marched to Athens. He found it almost deserted. All the Athenians had fled, save a little band who held the Acropolis. They hurled rocks upon the attacking Persians, and for a long time resisted them. At length, however, the Persians found a place where no guard had been stationed, because the rocky wall was so steep that it seemed impossible to scale it. Here they climbed up and rushed in upon the brave defenders. The struggle was soon over. Some of the Athenians hurled themselves headlong down the rocky slopes. The rest were put to death, and the city fell into the hands of the Persians, who plundered and burned it. Even the sacred olive tree, which had sprung up at Athene's touch, was burned to the ground. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of Famous Men of Greece. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Roger Moline. Famous Men of Greece by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 16. Themistocles. At this time the leading man of Athens was a great statesman and soldier named Themistocles. Some years before, when the news had come that Xerxes was collecting an army and intended to invade Greece, the Athenians sent messengers to Delphi to ask the oracle what they should do. Delphi was upon the side of Mount Parnassus, and there stood a temple of Apollo. It was built over the cleft in the rock which, you remember, Deucalion found long ago as he and Pyrrha were coming down the mountain after the flood. In the inner chamber of the temple, just over the cleft, was a 3-legged stool called a tripod. When a person wished to consult the oracle, the priestess, who was called the Pythia, took her seat on the tripod. In a few minutes her eyes would close and she would begin to talk. The words which she spoke were noted, and the Greeks believed that they were really the words of the god Apollo. Her answer to the messengers from Athens was, When everything else in the land of sea crops shall be taken, Jupiter grants to Minerva that the wooden wall alone shall remain undestroyed, and it shall defend you and your children. Stand not to await the attack of horses and foot from Asia, but retire. You shall live to fight another day. And thou, O divine Salamis, shalt destroy the children of women." What do you think this strange answer meant? The Athenians were greatly puzzled by it. Themistocles said that the wooden wall meant ships of war, and that the gods would save the people if they would leave their city and trust to their fleet when the enemy approached. He advised the Athenians to build more ships of war. The people at last came to believe him. Rich Athenians gave him money, and the people voted that the silver which was dug every year from the silver mines owned by the city should be used to pay for building ships of war. And thus, by the time Xerxes began his march, Athens had a fleet of 200 ships of war. These vessels were gigantic rowboats, each having as many as 150 oars. Each had also a mast with a single big sail, which was hoisted to help the rowers. The capture of Thermopylae had given the Persians an open road to Athens, and so the women and children of the city, and the men who were too old to fight, had been sent away in merchant ships to places of safety. A few men stayed in Athens and defended the citadel, as you learned in the last chapter. The rest went out in the warships with Themistocles to fight behind the wooden wall. Themistocles and the commanders of the fleets of the other Greek states took their vessels into the narrow straits of Salamis, which lay between the island of Salamis and the shore of Attica. Here the Persians followed them. Themistocles now wished the Greeks to give battle to the Persians, but the Spartan commander and the other Greek leaders were unwilling to risk a battle in the narrow strait. They proposed to retreat. Themistocles was determined, however, that a battle should be fought in the strait, so he sent word secretly to Xerxes that the Greek ships were going to try to get away, and advised him to head them off. Xerxes was delighted to get this message, and during the night he sent a part of his fleet up the shore of Attica to the other end of the strait, so as to hem the Greek fleet in between two lines of Persian ships. Next morning the Greek leaders all saw that there was nothing to do but fight, and at once their ships were drawn up in line of battle. Xerxes' throne had been placed on a high cliff on the shore of Attica, so that he might look down upon the battle. When the sun rose, he took his seat upon the throne. He was clothed in his royal robes and surrounded by the princes of his court. Below him were 1,000 Persian war vessels, while close to the shore of the island lay 378 Greek vessels. It seemed an easy victory for the Persians. The Greeks rowed forward from the shore of Salamis, shouting the cry, "We fight for all!" The Persians replied with their war cry, and the battle began. For a time the Persians had the advantage. But their ships were in the way of one another. Those in the front could not go back, those in the rear could not come forward. The confusion became terrible. Ship after ship of the Persians sank, some of them rammed by the Greeks, others run down by their own allies. In all, 200 Persian vessels were destroyed, and a great number captured, while the Greeks lost only 40. When Xerxes saw his 1,000 vessels sunk or captured or rowing away in flight, he determined to go back to Persia. He at once returned to northern Greece, where he left 300,000 men in command of his brother-in-law, Mardonius. With the rest of his army he marched on to the Hellespont. Here he found that storms had destroyed his bridges, so that what was left of his army was carried across to the shore of Asia Minor in ships. Everybody in Greece now admitted that Themistocles had been right in his explanation of the oracle that the wooden wall would save the people. And Salamis, as the oracle had said, destroyed the sons of women, but they were chiefly the sons of Persian, not Grecian women. The battle of Salamis brought fresh glory to Themistocles. After some years, however, he became unpopular and was banished from Athens. He stayed at Argos. Then the Spartans, who were his enemies, accused him of treason against Greece. Fearing that he could not get a fair trial at Athens, he fled to Persia. The Persian king gave him 3 cities to support him, and in one of these he lived until his death in 453 B.C. End of chapter 16. Recording by Roger Moline.
Chapter 17 of Famous Men of Greece. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Graham Redman. Famous Men of Greece by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 17. Aristides the Just. 1. Aristides was the rival of Themistocles. Themistocles was wise and brave, but selfish and fond of money. Aristides too was wise and brave, but he was also so honourable that the Athenians called him the Just. On one occasion he was acting as judge between 2 men. One of them had spoken unfairly of Aristides, and the other came secretly to Aristides to tell him of it. "My friend," said Aristides, "tell me the wrong the man has done to you, not what he has done to me. It is not my cause that I am to decide, but yours." Aristides opposed many plans that Themistocles wished to carry out, and so at length Themistocles determined to have him banished. There was at Athens a curious way of getting rid of a citizen. Every year this question was put before the people: "Does the safety of the state require that any citizen shall be banished?" If it was decided that this was necessary, the people were called upon to vote. No person's name was mentioned, but every citizen wrote on a small earthenware tablet the name of any man whom he thought dangerous to the state. The tablets were collected and counted, and if the name of any one man was written on as many as 6,000 tablets, he had to leave the city for 10 years. Banishing people in this way was called ostracism. We often use the word today. It comes from a Greek word meaning an earthenware tablet. Themistocles and his friends persuaded many of the Athenians that Aristides was a dangerous citizen. So when a public meeting was being held, the people were asked if they thought any citizen ought to be banished. No one mentioned Aristides' name, but Themistocles' friends said, "Let a vote be taken." While the vote was being cast, a countryman who could not write his own name came up to Aristides and said, "Friend, will you write the name of Aristides for me on this tablet?" "Has Aristides ever wronged you?" asked Aristides gently. "No," said the other, "I have never even seen him, but I am tired of hearing him called the Just." Aristides said no more, but wrote his own name on the tablet. There were enough votes against Aristides to banish him. As he was leaving Athens, he prayed the gods that the time might never come when his fellow citizens should have cause to be sorry for what they had done. That time came, however. 3 years later, when Athens was threatened by the Persians, the citizens, at the request of Themistocles himself, recalled Aristides. He sailed from his place of exile to the bay of Salamis, and went on board the ship of Themistocles only a few hours before the famous battle. Themistocles at once gave him command of one of the Athenian ships, and he did good service in the battle. 2. In the spring following the battle of Salamis, Mardonius, the Persian commander who was in Thessaly, tried to bribe the Athenians to become allies of the great king, but they refused his offers with scorn. He then marched to Athens, and the people abandoned the city so that it fell into his hands. The Greeks, however, collected an army of 110,000 men. Pausanias, a nephew of Leonidas, the hero of Thermopylae, was made commander-in-chief, but Aristides commanded the Athenian troops. Mardonius now retreated from Athens, destroying and burning as he went. The Greeks followed and overtook him near the city of Plataea, and there they defeated him in one of the decisive battles of the world. Mardonius himself was killed. It took 10 days to divide the spoil and bury the dead. 1/10 of the spoil was sent to Delphi and dedicated to Apollo, because the promise of his oracle that the wooden wall would save the city had led to the great victory of Salamis. A temple was erected to Minerva, and thank-offerings were made to other gods. Liberty games were established, to be held on the battlefield once in 4 years, and every year the tombs of those who had fallen in battle were to be decorated with flowers. The land upon which Plataea stood was declared to be sacred, and the inhabitants of the city were to be always free from attack by other Greeks. On the afternoon of the very day on which the battle of Plataea was won, the Greek fleet gained a great victory over the Persians at Mycale, on the coast of Asia Minor. After their defeats at Marathon, at Plataea, and at Mycale, the Persians never again attempted to conquer Greece. 3. As soon as the victory at Plataea had freed Greece from the ravaging Persian army, the Athenians flocked back to their ruined city, and began to rebuild it. Aristides and Themistocles carried on this work hand in hand. It was found that the sacred olive tree on the Acropolis, though burned to the ground, was not killed. From its root had sprung a stout young shoot. This was taken by the citizens as a good omen, and rebuilding of the city went on rapidly. The great seaport called the Piraeus was fortified, and a wall was built round the city. These and other public works required a great outlay of money, and it was needful to put some one whom all the citizens trusted in charge of the fund raised. Aristides was chosen, and enormous sums of money were placed in his hands. He used his office solely for the good of the people, and never became rich. When he died about 468 B.C., the whole nation mourned, and he was buried at public expense. End of chapter 17. Aristides the Just. Recording by Graham Redman.
Men of Greece. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MCY. Famous Men of Greece by John H. Haaren and A.B. Poland. Chapter 18. Simon. Part 1. You remember that when Xerxes was preparing to invade Greece, Themistocles tried to get the Athenians to build ships and quit their city, and trust to the wooden wall of a fleet. One day, while the people were still in doubt about what they should do, a tall and handsome young man, with a bridle in his hand, was seen hurrying through the streets of Athens toward the Acropolis. He entered the temple of Minerva, hung up his bridle as an offering to the goddess, and took down from the walls a shield. He prayed to the goddess and then carried the shields through the streets of Athens to the Piraeus. The young man was named Simon. He was the son of the famous Miltiades, and belonged to a class of Athenians called knights, who fought on horseback. For him to hang up his bridle in the temple was as much as to say that Athens now had no need of horsemen, but of seamen, as Themistocles was urging. People were fond of young Simon because of his pleasant ways, and when they saw that he thought well of Themistocles' advice, a great many who had not liked it changed their minds. Simon himself sailed in the Athenian fleet, and fought bravely in the battle of Salamis. He distinguished himself so much that not long after the Persians had been driven from Greece, he was elected admiral of the fleet. All that time there were a number of pirates living on the island of Cyrus in the Aegean Sea. They captured the merchant vessels that carried on the trade of the Mediterranean. Simon took possession of their island and made the Aegean Sea safe for traders. The island was the one on which Thetis had tried to hide Achilles when the Trojan War began, and somewhere upon it Theseus, the great hero of Athens, had been buried. Simon made a search for the burial place and found it. He took the bones out of the tomb and carried them to Athens. When he arrived at Athens and told that he had brought the bones of Theseus, the whole city was filled with rejoicing. Games were held and theatrical exhibitions given. The great poets Aeschylus and Sophocles were placed for the occasion. Simon took so much booty from pirates that after a while he became very wealthy. He was also very generous. His fine gardens were open to the public, and people were allowed to gather fruit in his orchard. The Athenians said, "He got riches so that he could use them, and then used them so that he got honor." His fellow citizens almost worshipped him. Part 2. After some years of fighting, the allies of Athens grew tired of warfare. So Simon agreed to let them furnish ships and money, and he hired seamen and marines from among the Athenians, so that though the fleet was in name the fleet of Greece, it was really Athenian. He drilled his men well in naval warfare, and took them on one expedition after another. Thus they became the finest sea soldiers in Greece. At one time Simon learned that there was a Persian fleet off the coast of Asia Minor. Immediately 200 ships were made ready, and he sailed to attack the Persians. They had about twice as many ships as he had, but the Greeks destroyed a great number of the Persian vessels and captured 200. Simon then disembarked his men and fought a Persian army on land. He completely defeated it, and so gained 2 victories in one day. Immediately after this, he was told that another Persian fleet was not far off, and at once he sailed to the spot and destroyed or captured all the ships and the men upon them. The Persian king was now glad to make peace. He agreed that no army of his should ever go nearer to the Aegean Sea than a day's journey on horseback, about 50 miles, and that none of his warships should ever sail near Greece. The spoil taken on Simon's great expedition was immense. It sold for so much that the Athenians took part of the money to pay for building the foundations of the great walls called the Long Walls. These were to connect Athens with her ports and serve also as fortifications. Simon paid for part of this work out of his own share of the spoils. It seems strange that the Athenians should ever have turned against Simon after all his victories. Yet they did. The reason was this. A terrible earthquake happened in Sparta. The whole city was ruined, and only 5 houses stood unharmed after the shock. One large building fell upon some of the young men and boys who were drilling and killed them. While everything was in confusion, and everybody was filled with alarm, the Helots flocked together from the fields, intending to massacre their masters. Fortunately, one of the kings heard in time that the Helots were arming themselves. He at once ordered an alarm to be given by sounding trumpets, and the Spartans seized their shields and spears and gathered together. When the Helots reached the city and saw the citizens ready to resist them, they went back into the country. But they had a large and powerful army, and they persuaded some neighbors of the Spartans to join them. Then they seized a strong fortress near Sparta. The Spartans were now in a dreadful plight. Their homes were in ruins, their slaves in revolt, and their neighbors aiding the slaves. In their distress they sent to the Athenians for aid. The Greek comic poet Aristophanes says, "There was a wonderful difference between the scarlet robe and the white cheeks of the Spartan who came to ask us for troops." Some of the Athenians advised that none should be sent. They thought it would be a good thing for Athens if Sparta lost her power, for the two cities were rivals. But Cimon persuaded his countrymen to send a large force. He said, "Athens and Sparta are the two legs of Greece. Do not suffer Greece to be maimed, and Athens to lose her companion." So Athenian soldiers went in command of Cimon, and fought for the Spartans. But the Helots and their allies were too strong. The fortress was not taken. Yet the Spartans suspected that the Athenians had not done their best, and they said that they wished no more Athenian help. This made the people of Athens very angry. They were enraged not only with the Spartans but with Cimon. They declared that any friend of Sparta was an enemy of Athens, and so they banished Cimon. Part 3. After the Spartans had conquered their slaves, they sent an army to attack Athens. A battle was fought not far from the city, and the Spartans gained the victory. Then someone was needed in Athens who could either beat the Spartans or make friends of them. Cimon was therefore recalled from banishment. Not long after his return he made a truce with the Spartans, which lasted for several years. Cimon thought that the best way to keep peace in Greece was to fight the Persians. So he fitted out a fleet and set sail from Athens to attack parts of the great king's dominions. He really hoped to overthrow the whole Persian Empire. Before making any attack, he sent friends to the oracle of Jupiter. The god refused to answer the question that they put and gave as a reason, "Because Cimon is already with me." The messengers wondered what this could mean, but when they reached the Greek fleet, they found that Cimon was dead. Some say he died of sickness, others of a wound which he had received while besieging a city. Before he died, he ordered his officers to conceal his death from the soldiers and to carry his body to Athens. This they did. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of Famous Men of Greece. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Famous Men of Greece by John H. Haaren and A.B. Poland. Chapter 19. Pericles. Section 1. Cimon had a rival named Pericles, who was the most able leader Athens ever had. He had the power of a tyrant, but he used it for the welfare of the people. He had many excellent laws passed. One was that a man accused of any crime should be tried by a certain number of his fellow citizens. This was like our trial by jury, and it gave an Athenian the same rights in a trial that an American citizen has today. Another good law proposed by Pericles was that any citizen who fought in the army or navy of Athens should be paid for doing so. Still, another of his laws was that if a poor man wished to go to the theater, he might get the money from the city treasurer to pay for his seat. You will remember that Themistocles and Aristides began to rebuild and beautify Athens after it had been burned by the Persians. This work was afterward carried on by Pericles. It was said that he found the city of brick and left it of marble. Under his orders, the white marble Parthenon, or Temple of Minerva, was erected on the Acropolis. It was one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. In front of it stood a bronze statue of Minerva, so large that it could be seen far out to sea. Within was a splendid statue of the goddess, nearly 30 feet high, which was of ivory and gold. Pericles made Athens strong as well as beautiful. He finished the long walls which Cimon had begun. These walls were built from the city to her ports, which were about 4 miles away. Between two of the walls was a roadway. by which in time of war provisions could be safely carried from the harbor to the city. Sparta was not pleased to hear of the fortifications of her rival. Athens might make herself beautiful if she chose, but she must not make herself strong. The Spartans watched for an opportunity to quarrel with the Athenians, and the opportunity soon came. The people of Corcyra, an island now called Corfu, lying off the west coast of Greece, went to war with the people of Corinth. Athens helped the Corcyraeans, Sparta the Corinthians. This was the beginning of a contest between Sparta and Athens, which desolated Greece for 27 years, 431 BC to 404 BC. It is called the Peloponnesian War because most of the states in the Peloponnesus took part in it and were allies of Sparta. Athens also had her allies. Athens was well prepared for war. She had a large sum of money in her treasury, a good fleet, and about 30,000 soldiers whom she could put into the field. The Spartans brought a force of 60,000 men into Attica to attack Athens. Pericles then urged the country people to leave their farms and homes and come into the city. They took his advice, and every vacant spot in Athens was filled with huts and tents. Pericles thought that Athens, protected by the long walls, could stand any siege. In this he was right, for the Spartans made no headway. But very soon the Athenians were attacked by a foe far more terrible than the Spartans. This was the plague. So many people were huddled together in the city that it was impossible to keep it clean and healthy. People began to sicken and die by the dozens, then by hundreds. The Spartans, fearing that the plague might attack them, retreated across the isthmus of Corinth into Peloponnesus. While Athens was in this desperate condition, Pericles acted most nobly. The plague carried off his eldest son, his sister, and many of his closest friends. Yet he went among the people, calming and cheering them, and attending faithfully to the affairs of the government. It was only when he laid the funeral wreath upon the lifeless body of his favorite son that he broke down and sobbed and shed a flood of tears. While the Spartan army was threatening Athens, and when the plague came, many of the Athenians blamed Pericles. But when he was in sorrow, all the Athens showed him the greatest respect and affection. Not long after the death of his son, he himself was stricken with a fatal illness. As he lay dying, one of those at his bedside spoke of the good they had done for Athens. "What you praise in my life," he said, "has been due to fortune. I deserve no credit for it. That of which I am proudest is that no Athenian ever wore mourning because of anything done by me." His death occurred in the 3rd year of the Peloponnesian War. It was a sad blow to the Athenians, for he was the greatest of all their statesmen. Section 2. One of the friends of Pericles was Phidias, the sculptor who molded the bronze figure of Minerva that stood in front of the Parthenon. He carved also the ivory and gold statue of the goddess that was inside the building. His fame spread over all Greece, and he was invited to adorn the temple of Jupiter at Olympia. For this temple he made his masterpiece. It represented Jupiter seated upon his throne. The statue was so perfect that it was considered one of the wonders of the world. When Phidias, after several years' absence, returned to Athens, he was persecuted by the enemies of Pericles, because he was known to be a friend of the great statesman. He was first accused of having stolen part of the gold which had been supplied by the city to decorate the statue of Minerva. Fortunately, when Phidias was working upon the statue, Pericles had advised him to fasten the gold in such a way that at any time it could be taken off and weighed. It was now removed and weighed, and the weight was found to be exactly what it should be. Phidias was then charged with having insulted the goddess Minerva, because he had carved upon her shield a likeness of himself and one of Pericles. On this charge he was cast into prison to await trial. Before the day of trial came, however, the great sculptor was taken sick and died. Under Pericles, Athens was at the height of her glory, and the 28 years during which he was at the head of the Athenian affairs are known in history as the Golden Age of Pericles. At no other time were there in Athens so many great painters, sculptors, writers, and philosophers. A celebrated historian who lived during the age of Pericles was Herodotus. He is called the father of history. Another famous historian of those days was Thucydides, who wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War. End of chapter 19.
Of famous men of Greece. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MCY. Famous Men of Greece by John H. Haaren and A.B. Poland. Chapter 20. Alcibiades. Part 1. During the age of Pericles, a young man named Alcibiades attracted a great deal of attention in Athens. He was a kinsman of Pericles, and was rich and handsome. But besides his money and his good looks, there was another thing that made the people of Athens think a great deal of him. He had won the crown 3 times in the chariot races at the Olympic Games. These games are said to have been established by Hercules. They consisted of boxing, wrestling, running, throwing the javelin, and racing with horses, and were held once in every 4 years in the valley of Olympia, in the little Greek state called Elis, which lay northwest of Sparta. They were so important that the Greeks reckoned time from the first Olympic Games of which they had a written account, as we reckon time from the birth of Christ. These games first took place in 776 B.C. The 4 years from one celebration to another were called an Olympiad. None but Greeks might take part in the Olympic Games, and while the contests were going on, tens of thousands of Greeks from every part of Hellas watched and applauded. To win the prize in any of the contests was the greatest honor for which a Greek could hope. The victor's name and the name of his birthplace were called aloud by a herald, and before the vast assemblage he was crowned with a wreath of wild olive, cut with a golden knife from a sacred grove said to have been planted by Hercules. His victories in the Olympic Games made Alcibiades the idol of the Athenians. The young men of Athens admired him so much that some of them dressed as he did, and even imitated the lisp with which he talked. He was in fact the leader of Athenian fops. Unfortunately, he had very bad faults. He was frivolous and thoughtless, and worst of all, he was not sincere. While talking with Socrates, the great philosopher, who was very fond of him, he could talk as if he were good, or at least wished to be. But the next day he might be leading his companions into all kinds of mischief. Yet with all his faults he was a brilliant genius. Even serious people admired him, and often took his advice. During the Peloponnesian War he persuaded the Athenians to undertake an expedition against the island of Sicily. He reminded them that Syracuse, the most important city of the island, was an ally of Sparta and an enemy to Athens. This was one reason he gave why the expedition should be undertaken. Another reason was the advantage that would come to Athens if she should add this fertile island to her possessions. An old Athenian general named Nicias opposed the expedition, but Alcibiades had his way. Ships and men were made ready, and were put under 3 commanders, Nicias, Alcibiades, and a man named Lamachus. One morning, shortly before the fleet was to set sail, it was discovered that a shocking insult had been offered to one of the gods. Along the streets of Athens, along the country roads, and in front of the houses were busts of Mercury, who was the protector of travellers. Ears and noses had been chipped from these busts in the night. The Athenians were a very religious people, and this insult to the god filled them with terror. All feared that Mercury would punish them by not protecting people walking on the streets and highways. Many thought that Alcibiades had chipped the busts for a frolic. Soon after the fleet reached Sicily, orders were received that he should return to Athens at once to answer the charge. Of course he had to give up his command. After he did so, one disaster after another befell the expedition. The fleet entered the harbor of Syracuse. The Syracusans then blocked the entrance so that the Athenian ships could not get out. In the battle that followed, half of Nicias' ships were destroyed. Nicias ran the rest ashore and tried to escape by land, but all were forced to surrender. The old commander was killed, and those of his men who did not die in battle or of starvation were sold into slavery. Not one of the ships of the fleet ever got back to Athens. Part 2. Alcibiades was either afraid that he could not clear himself, or that he could not get justice in the courts of Athens. He therefore pretended that he was going to obey the order for his return, but instead of doing so, he went for refuge to Sparta. When the Athenians heard of this, they passed a sentence of death upon him. In Sparta he was warmly welcomed, and by his pleasing ways became a general favorite. The Spartans, however, soon grew suspicious of him, and ordered him to be put to death as a traitor to them. He managed to escape and went to Persia. Here again, as at Athens and at Sparta, he made the people fond of him. But after a while the Persian governor, who had been his best friend, saw that he was treacherous and put him in prison. He escaped and went to a place on the Hellespont, where he joined the Athenian fleet. There he gave the commanders such advice that they gained a victory over the fleet of the Spartans and the land forces of the Persians. The Spartan admiral was killed. His successor wrote to Sparta, "Our glory is gone. The men are without food. We know not what to do." Alcibiades now thought that he might venture to go back to Athens. As he had given to the commanders of the Athenian navy the advice which won for them the victory of the Spartan fleet, the Athenians repented of having condemned him to death. So when he arrived in the Piraeus, with a small fleet of 20 vessels, he was allowed to land and go to Athens. In a very short time he persuaded the Athenians to give him command of their fleet. Then he sailed across the Aegean to fight against the Persians and Spartans. Unfortunately, he had to leave the fleet for a short time. During his absence, his lieutenant foolishly brought on a battle. The Athenians were defeated, and many of their ships were captured by the Spartans. With what was left of his fleet, Alcibiades then did the strangest thing possible. He attacked a city that was friendly to the Athenians and tried to make slaves of some of the inhabitants. Complaint was made of this to Athens, and the Athenians at once dismissed Alcibiades from the command of their fleet. After this he lived for some years in Asia Minor, where he owned a castle. One night his castle was surrounded by armed men, who set it on fire. He ran through the flames and tried to escape, but his enemies killed him. 404 B.C. End of chapter 20.